Hello and welcome to the Neuron Regeneration podcast. My name is Jared Carter, and this is going to be an episode that gets outside of the science of neuron regeneration. The majority of episodes in this podcast, in this video show, are going to be in regards to science. But the thing is that as important as science is, there are other factors that are absolutely vital to taking things from research into the clinic and actually helping people. And a huge one, if possibly the biggest one outside of the science itself, is funding. And so in this episode, I'm especially excited to present to you a conversation with Tom Kalil, who I'll read his bio in a moment, but he has had just a tremendous history and background in so many components of creating and funding breakthrough research that has changed the world. So let me read his bio. Tom Kalil was the Chief Innovation Officer at Schmidt Futures, i.e. Eric Schmidt, former CEO of Google. In that role, Tom led initiatives to harness technology for societal changes, improve science policy, and identify and pursue 21st century moonshots. Prior to Schmidt Futures, Tom served in the White House for two presidents, Clinton and Obama, helping to design and launch national science and technology initiatives in areas such as nanotechnology, the Brain Initiative, data science, materials by design, robotics, commercial space, high-speed networks, access to capital for startups, high-skill immigration, STEM education, learning technology, startup ecosystems, and the federal use of incentive prizes. And as you'll hear earlier this year in 2024, he launched Renaissance Philanthropy, where you'll hear plenty in this conversation what that's all about. But in my opinion, it is just an absolutely brilliant idea, and I am sure that it is going to drive a ton of innovation. And so if you are a researcher or you want to support a researcher that you feel like is going to make big changes in this world, and especially neuron regeneration and healing, this is a very important episode because there are various forms of funding, and I think the philanthropic one is especially important for early stage ideas and really high risk things that might have a really high reward if they work out, but it's not something that venture capitalists are going to be able to roll the dice on. And so you'll learn in here there are a number of ways and methods to getting in front of the right philanthropists and foundations and making that connection and funding your research. So with all that said, again, thank you as always for joining, and please enjoy my conversation with Tom Kalil. All right, Tom, thank you so very much. Really appreciate you taking the time. With your background and experience, I think we're going to get some great stuff here on everything to do with funding, experimentation, and driving the breakthroughs forward that we're hoping to find in the near
Happy to
future.
be here.
So why don't you start by telling us about Renaissance Philanthropy and what your motivation was for launching it?
Yeah, so our vision is that in the same way that wealthy Italian families supported an Italian Renaissance by backing Michelangelo and Da Vinci, today's philanthropists could be supporting a 21st century Renaissance that is fueled by advances in science, technology, and innovation. So if you look at the 2,000 families in the US with $500 million or more in wealth, their current level of philanthropy as a percentage of their wealth is 1.2%. So if you assume that they're doing as well as an index fund, they have room to significantly increase their philanthropy with no reduction in their wealth. So we're excited about the idea of working with philanthropists and foundations who want to get started, but may not want to do what Bill Gates did, which is to build a very large organization to help them with that.
Yeah. They have, in many cases, they have the wealth, but it's quite a lot of heavy lifting to set something like that up and vet all the potential things to fund, correct?
That's right. And some of them have made their wealth when they're still professionally active.
Hmm.
So they may have a CEO job, they may be raising a family. And again, they're interested in getting started, but they don't necessarily want to supervise a large organization. They may have no one full-time or maybe a very small staff, and that limits their ability to source, evaluate, select, and manage a portfolio of projects, particularly in technical areas.
Okay, yeah. And so how does it work? How do you work through Renaissance Philanthropy with these individuals and foundations?
Several different ways. One is that a member of the team will have conviction around a particular philanthropic thesis, and we might go out and proactively mobilize the financial resources to support a multi-donor collaborative. So, for example, our chief scientist, Joshua Elliott, he's very interested in climate emergencies. So these are areas where we're nearing a potentially irreversible tipping point, like the impact of the West Antarctic ice sheet on sea level rise. And so if he's successful, he will raise a fund that multiple philanthropists and foundations could contribute to try to go after some of these hard problems. In other areas, we're talking to philanthropists and foundations to find out what their priorities are. And if there's an overlap between what they care about and what we care about, we could do everything from give them advice to design and run programs on their behalf.
Okay. And then on the other side of that, with the researchers and entrepreneurs that are, driving these innovations, what's your role when it comes to them?
Yeah. So we're constantly talking to researchers, and we're also very interested in identifying people who have deep domain expertise and can identify investments that would move an entire field forward.
Hmm.
So, for example, if you look at the impact of AI on science, we make a lot of progress when a scientific community is organized around something called a common task framework.
Hmm.
So this is a well-defined problem, a large, open, diverse, high-quality data set, a benchmark, and a leaderboard. So, as you know, DeepMind and David Baker at the University of Washington just shared the Nobel Prize for their work on protein structure prediction and protein design. And the reason that that field has been able to make progress is you had a well-defined problem, namely, if you know the amino acid sequence, can you predict the protein structure? There was a large database, the protein data bank, that had 200,000 protein structures in it that the structural biology community had been contributing to for decades. And then you had a benchmark, the CASP, the Critical Assessment of Protein Structure Prediction, that gave researchers a sense for what was the global state of the art. And so that's an example of something that can move an entire field forward, a data set that could have an impact in a scientific field that the protein data bank has had on both protein structure prediction and protein design. So we call those people who can identify those types of opportunities a field strategist, because they're not just trying to say, oh, what is the next grant that I want from my lab? They're saying, are there opportunities to move this entire field forward in the same way that lowering the cost of sequencing the human genome from $100 million to $100 has had a transformational impact on the field.
Mhm. And before we get into some example projects that y'all are working on, just since you're talking about data sets and being open, in my experiences, I have access to one really powerful drug discovery AI. One of the challenges that I've run into is getting researchers to provide their data sets that aren't publicly available. And so in that common task framework, large open data sets, it sounds like is a real key. In the scenario where maybe there's limited data sets, or there's just a whole lot more data kind of on disk drives, or where, flash
Right.
drives somewhere, like any tips on getting researchers to take the time, be willing to, let those things go public.
Well, one thing I'm optimistic about is that I think the younger generation of scientists has much more of a commitment to open science.
Okay.
Not all of them do, but I think that's really where the center of gravity is in terms of uh, interest in not only freely available publications on preprint servers, but putting their software on GitHub and also making their data available.
Okay.
So a lot of, and I think that this is an area where funders can really help, because they can make sure that researchers are really incentivized to make their data available, and that it's a condition of accepting the funding. And not only is the data available, but it's available in a format, in a way which is genuinely useful.
Right. Yeah.
So, yeah. But I think open data is already important, and I think machine learning is making it more important over time.
Absolutely. Yeah. It sounds like just keep trying, and also with time we'll have more access to more data. So give us some example projects that Renaissance is working on right now, and funding, or that you guys
Yeah.
are looking for the sign.
So prior to launching Renaissance Philanthropy, which we did in May of this year, I was the Chief Innovation Officer at Schmidt Futures, which is a philanthropic initiative supported by Eric and Wendy Schmidt. And I continue to serve as the chair of an organization called Convergent Research. It's a nonprofit organization that helps identify and launch a new form of funding research called a focused research organization. And this was an idea of two early career scientists who observed that there was a class of problems that you couldn't do in a university, but you also couldn't do as a venture-backed startup.
Mm.
And so what they proposed was to create time-bound research nonprofits with a CEO. So they have the unity of purpose that you see with a well-run startup, in the sense that everyone is rowing in the same direction, everyone has the same North Star, but because they're philanthropically funded, have the ability to work on things that are difficult to monetize. And there are two of those projects that are directly related to neuroscience. One is called E11. So the genesis of the name is that humans have 100 billion neurons. So that's one with 11 zeros after it. And it's trying to solve the following problem, which is that experts have estimated what the cost of doing the connectome for the whole mouse brain
Mhm.
would be, and have estimated that it would cost $10 billion. Given that I worked at the White House for two presidents, I'm pretty confident in saying that politicians are unlikely to give neuroscientists $10 billion to map the mouse brain. So this team is working to lower the cost of connectomics by a factor of 100 using a breakthrough that came from Ed Boyden's lab at MIT in expansion microscopy. So the idea here is, rather than trying to improve the resolution of the microscope, you use a polymer that makes the thing that you're looking at under the microscope bigger.
Hmm.
And they believe that by combining expansion microscopy and protein-based barcoding, that would allow you to give every neuron its own unique barcode, that the combination of those could lower the cost of mapping the brain by a factor of 100. The second project is called Forest Neurotech, and it is shrinking the size of a focused ultrasound machine down to the size of a chip for minimally invasive treatments like treatment-resistant depression. And if this is successful, you can imagine a situation where someone who is trying to develop a new therapy, that this would function almost as a Apple App Store, in the sense that they don't need to develop the hardware. They just need to develop the software that is, figuring out what sort of modulation using focused ultrasound it makes sense to use for a given neurological condition.
And would
So
those be surgically implanted or otherwise?
these would be minimally invasive, so they would be in the skull, but not the brain.
Ah, okay. Okay.
Yeah. So it doesn't require actually putting it in the brain, which obviously makes a lot of things like, deep brain stimulation a lot trickier.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'd like to switch gears a little bit and get at the vast experience you've had with fundraising of all types, and helping scientists to do that, and pairing them with the right funders, and
Mhm.
contexts. And so, and many listening here are interested in finding the common denominators to neuron health and healing, such that we can create therapeutics that are hopefully helpful in most or all different trauma types and disorders.
Mhm.
Now, in a world where FDA drug approvals are done on an indication specific basis,
Mhm.
how does that give you any direction in what you would say, like somebody who's looking to create something that's really broad and goes, across multiple indications. How does someone like that attract funding when ultimately to get something approved, you're going to have to pull it down to, a single indication or multiple individual applications?
Yeah, so I think there are some funders who are interested in platform technologies that have the ability to address more than one indication. But I think you're right that typically when you're going to a venture capitalist and you say, oh, I have a platform technology, they might say, yeah, that's nice, but what's the first indication that you're going to go after?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that view stems from the fact that the the majority of the value associated with these platform technologies is captured by the companies who are developing drugs. Um, there have been a couple of instances in which companies have experimented with new structures, like having a holding company that has the intellectual property for the platform technology, and then having the VCs invest in the companies that are going after particular indications. I think one thing to know about philanthropy is the heterogeneity of philanthropy. And what I mean by that is, by and large, if you've met one philanthropist, you've met one philanthropist.
Mm-hmm.
So I think in the world of investing, you have risk adjusted return as the common metric that they might use to evaluate investment opportunities. But I think there's a much greater heterogeneity in the world of philanthropy. So they could differ by what causes they care about,
Mm-hmm.
what check size they feel comfortable writing, how they make decisions, whether they have a professional staff, whether there are particular institutions like an academic medical center where they receive their treatment that they have a close relationship with, whether there's a place-based dimension to their giving, and whether if they're interested in biomedical research, whether they're interested in supporting biomedical research very broadly, or whether they're interested in, not only cancer, but like a specific type of cancer.
Mm-hmm.
So I think one of the things that is challenging about philanthropy is that heterogeneity and the fact that although some philanthropists are and foundations are pretty transparent about what it is that they support, and a lot of times there may not be any information online about what a given philanthropist cares about, who their staff is, and how to get in touch.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And so to piggyback on that, with so many different things out there that are very worthy scientific pursuits and issues, how does one best go about getting a philanthropist to support the one you champion, other than, I would say, other than just finding those that care about the same thing you're working on,
Yeah,
right? Beyond that, right?
yeah. So I would say that's the most important thing. I think that in the field of science and technology, I think an advantage you have is the ability to tell a why now story. And why don't I give an real life example?
Yeah.
So I was talking to a philanthropist who cares about ALS, and I told the philanthropist four things that I'd learned by talking to the research community. Number one, some versions of ALS are monogenic.
Mhm.
Number two, we now have CRISPR. Number three, because of the pandemic, we invested heavily in lipid nanoparticles as a platform for drug delivery. And number four, some researchers are MD PhDs and work with patients on their end of life decisions. And so, with consent of the patient and the family, these researchers are able to start the drug discovery process in humans as opposed to in mice, and then being shocked to learn that what works in mice doesn't always work in humans.
Yeah.
So my point to this philanthropist was not, oh, this is definitely going to work. This is a sure thing, because obviously that doesn't, if something was a sure thing, it wouldn't be research. My point to the philanthropist was, we now have a set of capabilities that we didn't have until recently, and that this approach is, at least in my view, worth taking a bet on. So the ability to combine a goal that a philanthropist would say, wow, if I could contribute to that, I would view that as an important part of my legacy. And the why now, what has changed about the world that means that what was previously impossible may now be within reach, I think can create the basis for a positive self-fulfilling prophecy.
Mhm.
In the same way that when a political organizer says 1 million people are going to march on Washington, every once in a while that actually happens.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah. So finding a foundation or philanthropist who obviously is interested in the same thing you're working on, but having the why now story of what we have now that we didn't recent and not until
Yeah,
recently, and why that's going to give us a better chance of you making a real impact with your philanthropic dollars.
yeah, yeah. And, this is not something that's important to all philanthropists, but it's an idea that I'm particularly interested in is, are there ideas that could move an entire field forward?
Mhm.
So, for example, if I were a cancer researcher, if I were a philanthropist who was interested in supporting cancer research, one challenge that I might have is I think in the US alone, there are over 60,000 cancer researchers. So how am I as a philanthropist try to figure out like which one to support?
Mhm.
But if there is a view about the type of project that would move that entire field forward, or at least some aspect of it,
Mhm.
that might be something compelling to support. So I'll give you a concrete example. So an economist who studies the economics of innovation now at Dartmouth University, Heidi Williams, has calculated the social net present value of having better biomarkers for cancer
Mhm.
and concluded that it was $2.2 trillion. So the reason that the societal payoff is so large is that if you have a really solid biomarker that the FDA is willing to rely on as a surrogate endpoint, the clinical trials are shorter,
Mhm.
the net present value of investing in new therapies is higher, so companies invest more, and survival time increases at a faster rate. So she was able to compare what is the increase in survival time for those cancers where we have a good biomarker
Mhm.
versus those where we don't, and see a really significant faster rate of survival time. And then if you value a human life at $100,000 a year,
Mhm.
was able to calculate what the benefits to society are. Now, unfortunately, again, the economic value is in the therapies, not in the biomarker.
Mhm.
So companies are under investing in biomarkers relative to their importance. And so my argument to a philanthropist is you should be trying to have a but for impact. You should be trying to identify an area in this field that the private sector is under investing in. But if the team you back is successful, it would move the entire field forward, like a really solid biomarker that the FDA would rely on as a surrogate endpoint, or a data set that would transform the way we use machine learning or platform technology that allows us to perturb and measure some complex biological system in a way that we weren't able to do in the same way that expansion microscopy may dramatically lower the cost of mapping the brain.
Mm. Okay. And I don't know if it's uh, if I'm taking this in the right way, but I'm just curious, is what we're looking to do in the field of neurology and finding, why are neurons, as the vast majority of neurons, why do they have such a limited regenerative capability? And if we can find a way to overcome those limitations such that it benefits, the entire field,
Yeah,
would that be what you're
yeah.
describing? Yeah.
So if you had a philanthropist who was interested in saying, hey, is there a way I can contribute to progress in more than one disease in this broad area? Absolutely. I think what you'd have to convince them of is that we have enough fundamental knowledge
Mhm.
about why neural regeneration is difficult, but why there might be an approach that works, number one, and number two, if it were successful, could make a contribution to more than one disease. So that's where you get to the my first observation about philanthropists is that if you've met one philanthropist, you've met one philanthropist. So you might have some philanthropists who are really excited about that idea, right? It's
Yeah.
like, wow, I could invest in one technology and it has a an impact on multiple diseases. You might have other philanthropists who say, well, I care about, you know, ALS or something like that. So I'm really interested in something that is really going to be focused on ALS. So I think there's a difference within the philanthropic community about, the sort of understanding and appreciation of platform approaches as opposed to approaches that are going to be targeted to an individual disease.
Okay. Yeah. We do. I do have, well, I should say we do. We have some experiments focused on different mouse models, one of them being ALS. So if our discovery projects return exciting results, I'll remember to reach out to you since you have somebody that's interested in that particular syndrome. So if you're in the boat of a researcher doing discovery phase work where it's very difficult to get venture capital funding and grants are, well, certainly NIH grants and a lot of grants are really more given to the lower risk type stuff, and you're trying to do stuff that's like we talked about, moving an entire field and high risk. It's obviously a very difficult problem. Where do you suggest researchers like that look for funding first, and any other tactics or advice you
Yeah.
can give to someone in that boat?
Well, I'm very excited about the creation of ARPA-H,
Hmm.
and it's really building on the DARPA model. So a lot of the a lot of the leadership of ARPA-H has previously served in DARPA. And one of the jokes at DARPA is if you don't do something as important as inventing the internet, then you get a B.
Yeah.
And so they have this saying, DARPA hard. And what they mean by that is there's not an interest in supporting things that are incremental.
Hmm.
There is a willingness, not to do crazy things, but to take a bet on an idea or a team that might be risky, but if it is successful, would have a massive payoff.
Hmm.
And so I think they've really brought that ethos to ARPA-H. And so, for example, there is a ARPA-H program manager who joined in August. His name is Jean Hébert. I believe it's pronounced Hébert.
Hmm.
And he's very interested in regenerative medicine, particularly as it relates to neuroscience.
Okay.
So I think looking at what programs he ultimately gets approved is one thing that this community might want to keep an eye on.
Great. Great. That's exciting. I'll try to connect through. If we shift gears a little bit, staying on the fundraising and kind of moving, solving huge challenges. You and I just met at the X Prize Visioneering event.
Mhm.
Um, where do you feel that that competition-based approach could fit in to all this in terms of, getting funding for work? I mean, like for instance, when I was going through that process and listening to all this, and I was thinking, they're getting hundreds of teams to work on this problem at the shot at winning $100 million, right? Which is
Mhm.
obviously very exciting. But they have to obviously come up with the money to do the work to
Right.
get there, right? So where, I mean, I don't know if you know this, via X Prize, but like, where do most of those teams get the funding to do the work that they do to try and win the prize?
Well, I don't know where all of them get them funding from. I know that in the past, some of them have been able to get sponsors. So probably the most successful X Prize was the Ansari X Prize, which was for a rocket that could go up 100 kilometers, carry the equivalent of 3 people, and repeat that within a 2-week period. The winning team for the $10 million prize received $26 million in upfront funding from the late Paul Allen.
Mm.
One of the government supported prizes for a self-driving car supported by DARPA. The first time they ran it, nobody won. The second time they ran it, a Stanford team won. And if you look at that vehicle, you'll see all of the logos of the sponsors of that.
Hmm.
So it was sort of like a NASCAR situation with multiple sponsors.
They actually ran that prize twice because the first time there wasn't a winner.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Okay. Wow.
And yeah, the the leader of the winning team, Sebastian Thrun, Larry Page was at the finish line. He promptly acquired the winning team, and that's where X and Waymo came from.
Hmm. Yeah.
So we're now enjoying the benefits of that in the Bay Area, and I hope the rest of the country begins to get access to that as well.
I'll tell you, when I was just there, at the X Prize event, that was the first time I had that experience of looking to my left out of my Uber, and there's no one driving that car. And I
Yeah,
was like, whoa, this is yeah, just like looking into the future, but it's now. It
yeah.
really blew me away. That was wild.
So another approach that has been used uses milestone payments.
Mm.
So, for example, if you look at the NASA SpaceX collaboration, when NASA retired the space shuttle, the US government had to pay the Russians $50 million for every astronaut they wanted to send to the space station.
Well,
And so NASA said to SpaceX, if you can build us a rocket that can go to the International Space Station and deliver and retrieve cargo and ultimately crew, not only will we buy rides on the rocket, but we'll also provide you with milestone payments for intermediate progress towards that goal.
okay.
And so you see more of these prizes with like, a phase one, a phase two, and a, grand prize for the achieving the ultimate goal. And that's something that can help cash constrained teams support their development.
That makes
The
sense.
other thing you can try to do as the team designing the prize is to figure out whether there are ways to lower the barriers to entry. So Gil Pratt, who was at DARPA and designed the DARPA Robotics Challenge, he had in the early part of the competition, he allowed teams to demonstrate progress that they could make using a simulation. And then some of the best results from teams that were using a simulation, he then gave them $1 million robot so they could participate in future phases of the competition.
Okay. Very cool. So let's say there's researchers listening now and they want to seek funding from philanthropists that might be interested in what they're working on. How do they find them? Are there platforms? How do they go about even getting connected with potential philanthropic funders in the first place?
Yeah, so they have to find out whether there are philanthropists who are supporting work in that area, number one. And number two, whether they have a professional staff that is supporting that and whether there's any information about how to reach those staff.
So just be really like Google search for.
Yeah, or people in your network.
Mhm. So there's not like a centralized platform
There's not a centralized,
that
yeah.
says this
Yeah, I mean,
person is
there are
interested in
there
this.
are certainly publications like, I think there's one called the Chronicle Philanthropy, which has a database of major gifts that have been made. But if there is a website that lists what every philanthropist cares about and how to get in touch with them, I'd like to know about it.
Yeah, I was gonna say
Yeah.
that sounds like a business right there. That would be interesting. How do you and your team at Renaissance, how do you connect with your philanthropists and decide who to work with?
Yeah, so, we're looking for some indication that they are potentially excited about science and technology. And then we try to figure out how we get a warm introduction to them if we don't already have that relationship.
Mhm. And I love, your explanation of the average, family with a certain net wealth. Um, giving much less than what they could make just with that wealth invested, and therefore there is this
Mhm.
gap that they could take advantage of and give more without, essentially losing their any wealth.
Mhm.
Is that is that I don't want to say argument, but is that something you lead with when in those conversations?
No, I think it's more we want to find out what they care about, and then we can tell them either immediately or after some research what ideas and teams that we've seen that we're excited about and why,
Yeah.
and what are some of the ways in which we think that philanthropy can have a, but for impact.
Mhm. And
Um,
on the same note, how do you guys go about finding and deciding what you're excited about when it comes to the researchers and teams?
we go to conferences when we meet a researcher that we're really impressed by in terms of their creativity and ambition and track record of delivering. We ask them, who else have you met that you're impressed by?
Mm,
In some cases, we'll do an open call. So rather than saying, okay, well, we know this researcher, we're we're going to fund that researcher. We might do an open call, and the the good news is we get to know researchers or companies that we didn't know before. The bad news is we can get flooded with 1,000 proposals, so it just winds up being a lot more work.
yeah, yeah. And once you've kind of paired that up, you've got your philanthropist that's really excited about funding somebody or a team working on something that y'all are excited about. I know from just in my little bit of experience doing this in the last couple of years that licensing and tech transfer and all that kind of stuff can create hurdles and delays.
Mhm.
When it comes to giving philanthropically, are most of these folks asking for any sort of licensing rights associated with the work they're
Depends
funding?
on the philanthropist. Yeah, I think for some philanthropists, it's a non-issue. And for others, their question is, hey, why shouldn't I be investing in this as a company? Shouldn't I get like the equivalent of a safe or an unpriced round so there are ways to have recoverable grants. So I could give a research team a grant, and then if they don't raise any money, it stays a grant. But if they raise money, then it converts into equity at whatever value the third party investor placed in
That's
it.
interesting. So, okay, so grant, but then if they go to like a Series A, if it's going to go forward, then it converts it. That sounds interesting.
Yeah,
It's good to know. All right. Well, I can't thank you enough for your time. I know you're extremely
sure.
busy. Maybe we could wrap it up and just ask if, in regards to Renaissance or anything else you're working on, do you have an ask or any parting thoughts for the Neuron Regeneration podcast audience?
Yeah. So, one of the things that I have been telling researchers is that there's a real value to getting together as a community to develop a research agenda that, not just one researcher or company, but multiple researchers and companies are excited about and they think would move the field forward in the same way that, I've talked about biomarkers, data sets, and new and improved platform technologies, all as examples of things that fit in that category. So is there an opportunity for a philanthropist to have this outsized impact by making an investment that would lift all boats, as opposed to saying of the, hundreds or thousands of researchers who are active in this space, how am I going to pick one?
Right. So if there's not already that kind of gather, like, literally you're saying like they would almost be a collective where somebody could put money into that collective and it would go towards their common goals?
Or that there is some mechanism for identifying exciting opportunities. So, for example, in the field of synthetic biology, there is something called the Engineering Biology Research Consortium, and they develop roadmaps to say these are the types of projects that we think will move the field of engineering biology forward.
Mm.
The computer science community has something like this. The Computing Community Consortium, and it's continually refreshing the computer science research agenda. The astronomy and astrophysics community get together and say, of all the things like the federal government could support, what are the ground-based and space-based telescopes that we're most excited about?
Okay, good thing to keep in mind. Again, a lot of things that are associated with neuron healing, it's still very syndrome specific. I'm not sure that there's that kind of consortium specific to this. If as I get deeper into this, I find that there's not, maybe I can help facilitate that. And yeah, like you said, so you're really creating an agenda of these are the types of things that we really feel are going to move this forward and help us figure out this huge problem.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so very much, Tom. It was great meeting you in person a couple weeks ago, and I appreciate you hopping on here to share your wisdom with us.
No, happy to do it. Great conversation, and I really enjoyed the discussion.
All right, thanks again so much.
Take care.